The Battle of Ardnaree. While Elizabeth I attempted to complete the Tudor conquests of Ireland, the Irish question would be one that would plague her for most of her reign. But the question of how to govern Ireland was one of the most difficult issues, either through fair means or foul. Her Irish administration's leader was Sir John Perrot, as Lord Deputy of Ireland. Perrot was allegedly Queen Elizabeth's half-brother. Perrot was dispatched to Ireland in 1571 as President of Munster, with orders to suppress and bring to heel the Gaelic and Anglo-Irish lords who had rebelled. He resigned his post in 1573 and returned to London without permission. After spending the interim in Wales and having to leave under a cloud, he returned to Ireland in 1584 as Lord Deputy, with the orders to crush the Irish and appropriate their lands. Sir Richard Bingham was appointed governor of the Presidency of Connacht in 1584. Combined with Perrot, they would control Ireland as a military dictatorship, utilising famine, fire and martial law to bring Ireland to heel. Far from creating the conditions for triumph of the common law, absolutist agencies such as Bingham's merely sought to provoke an eradication of those who stood in their way. In 1586, Sir Richard Bingham was on a crusade in Connacht, while the Privy Council in the Pale attempted to govern a fractured and resistant country. Perrot was effectively undermining Bingham's mandate, causing Bingham to warn him that his position would have a negative effect on the campaign in Connacht. Bingham was a ruthless English naval officer and a soldier who was sent to Ireland to impose the Queen's will through fire and sword. From Dorset, England, he was one of 11 children. He was the youngest in the family and junior to his two brothers, John and George, both of whom would serve under him as sheriffs in Mayo and Sligo. He was said to have had enormous thirst for Irish blood and was universally despised by the local people because of his barbaric cruelty. He came here initially to suppress the Second Desmond Rebellion in 1579. On his arrival, he was involved in the siege of Smerwick, with the successful lifting of the siege on the promise of quarter. Subsequently, the English massacred the surviving Spanish papal troops on the 10th of November, 1580. In 1584, Bingham was appointed Governor of Connacht, Lord President of Connacht, and was assigned the task of imposing the composition of Connacht and of suppressing Mayo rebels. It is said he reigned over Connacht with neither justice nor mercy, gaining the name the Flail of Connacht by those subjugated by his merciless governance. The Burkes were an Anglo-Norman noble family who were said to have, over the centuries, become more Irish than the Irish themselves. They refused to accept the composition being imposed on them and were treated as rebels as they fought to preserve their ancestral lands. But they submitted when they had to and used the English against their enemies' clans as needed. After the death of their chieftain, Richard Burke, Queen Elizabeth's administration forbade that the Burkes allow a new claimant to the MacWilliamship, which means the clan leader. As the main allies of the Burkes, the Joys, O'Malleys, MacFiblins and MacGibbons had ensured the excesses of Bingham's brutal administration, and with no end in sight of the executions and being cornered by his judicial sessions, Bingham had managed to unite the Gael and Anglo-Irish against him. This would result in a call to arms and a rising out, an Iri Amach, in an open challenge to English rule. With the Mayo rebels now in open revolt, and Elizabeth's proxies pursuing a scorched earth policy, total and absolute war had come to Connacht. England's policy towards Ireland was that rebellious areas should be spoiled, wasted and burned. In 1585, the English Lord Deputy Sir John Perrot introduced a new system of governance known as the Composition of Connacht, which sought to abolish the customs and laws of the indigenous Brehon system and replace them with English laws. This affected all aspects of life, including the way in which Gaelic chieftains were elected to office, as distinct from the English system of primogeniture, and by which they had governed their individual territories for generations. Through a combination of coercion, fear, as well as for personal gain and advancement, the majority of the Gaelic chieftains signed the composition, including the most powerful chieftain in Mayo, the MacWilliam. By Gaelic custom, every chieftain in the county was bound to the MacWilliam by the payment of annual tributes known as cuttings and spendings, as well as by obligatory military service. Consequently, this was a title which the English composition sought to abolish. While Perrot was the architect of the composition, its implementation on the ground was left to Sir Richard Bingham, the English governor of Connacht. The methods by which Bingham sought to subdue the Connacht chieftains included execution by martial law, including the young and elderly, torture, scorched earth warfare, as well as hostage-taking. A professional soldier and military tactician, a thorough administrator, Bingham's singular failing was his inflexibility and rigid adherence to orders, as well as a racism invoked by his mantra, "The Irish were never tamed with words, but with swords." When the MacWilliam of Mayo, Richard Burke, died in January 1586, the Gaelic and English systems regarding succession collided. When the elected Taoiseach by Gaelic law, Edmund Burke of Castlebar, was denied the title and extensive lands, castles and tributes that go with it, in favour of Richard Burke's eldest son, by English law his legal successor, the Burkes of Mayo and their allies O'Malley's, MacPhilbins and McGibbons rose in rebellion against Bingham. They were joined by Tibbet Burke following his release from custody in Sligo, and by his mother, who, with her galleys, brought in a contingent of galloglass from Scotland to aid the rebellion against Bingham. In retaliation, Bingham executed many of the young Burke children who were hostages in his custody, and with a large army devastated the lands of those in rebellion, taking a huge prey of their cattle herds. On a plundering raid into Grace O'Malley's territory on the north shore of Clew Bay, she later recorded she was apprehended and tied with rope, spoiled of her castle and brought to Sir Richard, who caused a new pair of gallows to be made for her where she thought to end her days. The rebellion fizzled out when Bingham captured the Taoiseach Edmund Burke. He was tried for treason and, despite his great age, executed, with his Castlebar estate, later acquired by Bingham's relations, became forfeit to the crown. By August 1586, most of the Mayo Burkes and their allies had entered peace negotiations with Bingham. When news broke that a huge army of Scottish mercenaries was on the march through Ulster en route to Mayo to help the Burke rebellion, the sons of Edmund Burke broke from the negotiations to join them. Grace O'Malley, who, as part of the peace negotiations, had been released from custody by Bingham, set off in her galleys towards Ulster. Whether to provide transport for the approaching Scottish force is unclear, but in her later evidence she claims that en route, her galleys, by a tempest being broken, she was obliged to remain in Ulster until they were repaired. In the summer of 1586, this contingent of galloglass arrived from Scotland and was based in Inishowen, County Donegal. The Burkes sent a messenger to seek their assistance against their feuding enemy clans and against Bingham's forces, who were imposing English rule. William Burke of Ardnaree and John and Slieve Burke were sent into Ulster for the purpose of hiring the Scots as mercenaries. After the customary bargaining, they agreed to aid the Burkes, as their ancestors, the Clandonald Galloglass, had done since the middle of the 14th century. On the promise of land and pay, they consented to move southwest to Mayo with their families to help in the conflict. In early September, a contingent of around 1,400 Galloglass mercenaries and another 1,400 of their wives and children departed from Inishowen in Donegal and headed towards Mayo on what was to be an ill-fated journey. Bingham received information that the Scots, after some skirmishes in Maguire's country of Fermanagh, had reached the River Erne. Bingham knew that if he risked open battle, he would be wiped out. Meanwhile, back in Mayo, Bingham had moved swiftly through the county against the rebels. He harried them from bush to bush and treetop to treetop. He then hanged an elderly man, Edmund Burke, in Castlebar, who was the claimant to the MacWilliam lordship, which was the leadership of the Burke clan. Although he was in his 80s and had lost a leg in a previous rebellion, he was carried to the gallows and hanged. Bingham also held 7 other Burkes and many others until the clan submitted and offered 3 young sons and relatives as pledges of their future good conduct. Bingham later murdered these children in retaliation for the Burkes' rebelliousness and was put on trial twice for his savage treatment of the people of Mayo. Queen Elizabeth later released Bingham, deciding that with all his cruelties, he had not been cruel enough for the Irish. Although word had most likely spread that the attempted rebellion was squashed, the Scots headed for Mayo to settle and crossed the River Erne in County Donegal in late August 1586. The Gallowglass made their way through South Fermanagh and towards Sligo. Bingham, realising the threat, began a major recruitment and gunpowder collection in Galway in preparation for the coming fight. Bingham reached out to the Gallowglass at Sligo. He sought to know their intentions and why they had come to Connacht. They replied with honesty about their intent, while they were being opposed by a person who responded with deception. The Scot mercenary leadership, Donald Gore MacDonald and Alexander Cara MacDonald, son of James MacDonald, wrote to Bingham that they are come over the Erne with a great number of men, being drawn in by the Clan Williams and the Clan Donalds, who are their cousins, and they shall give them entertainment and the spoil of Connacht. And James MacDonald, his sons, have no other shift but to take an enterprise upon themselves, for such will give them most, as all other soldiers in the world do use. And whoever in Connacht shall forbid them, or let them thereof, they will not take it at their hands, except they be stronger than they, or of greater power. This is sufficient. Signed, I, Donald Gore MacDonald, and I, Alexander Cara MacDonald. This letter was probably written about the 26th of August 1586. Both of the MacDonald brothers were killed in Ardnaree within a month of penning the letter. Bingham mustered an army to meet them, but the Scots were not wanting to engage in battle while burdened by their families, and their main objective was to enter Mayo without a battle and to join up with the main army of the Burkes and their co-relatives. Bingham later wrote, I lay at Sligo and at the foot of the Curlews, with my said forces, fronting the Scots and keeping them from entering the country. On their first night in the area, the Scots stayed between the River Duff and the River Drose on the Sligo-Leitrim border. They then moved towards Dartree along the Benbow Hills. They reached Drumahare, County Leitrim, where they camped for 3 nights before moving to Kilronan. Meanwhile, Bingham and his army came from the west and stopped at Ballinafad between Sligo and Boyle. Both armies stayed in these places for the next 2 weeks, without either side attacking each other. Bingham then heard through his spies that the Scots were not headed north into the barony of Tira, West Sligo. Instead, they were headed towards Roscommon. A confrontation over a 14-day period took place at Ballinafad, and the Scots continuously made efforts to reach their intended final destination of Mayo. On September 16th, the Scots reached Balahi, where they turned and backtracked. Bingham tried to block their route and resided at Ardglass. On the 19th of September, they reached Coolcarney. They were now tantalisingly close to their destination. And on the 20th of September, they reached Ardnaree. The Scots seized the castle on their arrival and settled in Ardnaree and the nearby countryside of Attimass and Bonnyconlon. Bingham heard, through his spies, where they were located and wrote from Ardnaree on the 23rd of September, the day after the massacre, in a letter to Lord Deputy Perrot, where my spy brought me certain word that they were at Kildermot or at Ardnaree, persuading and practising with the Burkes of Tyrawley to join with them. With the knowledge that his enemy were near Aclair, Bingham deployed a new tactic. Up until now, his strategy was to stay close to the Scots and to harass and interrupt their convoy whenever possible. Now, though, the game changed to hide and go seek. The new strategy was to not interfere with the Scots at all, but to await the reinforcements that had been promised by Lord Deputy Perrot in the Pale. In his efforts to deceive the Scots and to drop their guard, Bingham withdrew from the area completely and went south to Moygarra Castle on the banks of Loch Garra. Was this based on false information received by him, or was it, as he claimed, to protect Roscommon from being plundered by the enemy? Bingham also went to Castlemore near Balhedrine during this time. His quest to build an even larger army and stock up on gunpowder continued, and it is reported that he sourced supplies of gunpowder in Galway. Bingham's latest information from his spies was that the Scots had moved from Coolcarney on the mountaintop and were camped at a marvellously fast and strong ground on the other side of Slieve Gav, the Ox Mountains. Bingham left Castlemore near Balhedrine and went with his army to Banada Abbey through a pass called Litcher. The night forsook him and his company, and they forsook the highway. They crept low and silently as possible towards the peaceful countryside that was soon to be tragically scarred by the events about to be visited upon it. On the day before the battle, the 22nd of September, Bingham heard from a spy that the Scots had left Coolcarney and were camped at Ardnaree. Apart from being famous as warriors, the new arrivals in town, the Galloglass, were known for enjoying drinking and carousing. After months of travel over land and sea, and faced with constant threat since entering Connacht, they had good reason to celebrate their arrival and proximity to their destination across the Moy. Their leadership made an announcement which was reported back to Bingham by a priest who had been taken prisoner from Banada Abbey but later escaped. Edmund MacCostello found the priest in the countryside near Banada Abbey. What he told Bingham revealed a great deal about the intentions and aspirations of these new arrivals in Ireland. He reported that the Scots were most assuredly all encamped at Ardnaree, and that they proclaimed the whole country to be theirs. They were announcing that Bingham had returned to Roscommon and that his troops had forsaken him, and that whoever came to them would receive a céad míle fáilte, or 100,000 welcomes, and would come to no harm. Bingham asked the priest to escort him to where the Scots were camped, but he declined, volunteering 2 local O'Hara men to go with him instead. Spies were sent to Ardnaree on a reconnaissance mission and returned to Bingham with greater details soon after. Bingham now had the knowledge and the numbers to his advantage. And the Scots had their back to a raging river due to the recurring storms all summer long. The magnificent, loud-sounding, salmon-filled River Moy, which was at that time wider than the River Liffey in Dublin as it ran unchecked through the Mayo countryside. Meanwhile, Bingham had accumulated so many reinforcements that he ran out of food and sent his Captain Woodhouse off to plunder cattle in the countryside. His troops needed to refresh themselves with Connacht beef before being sent on their deadly mission. Bingham seized his opportunity, knowing that the Scots were prevented by the force of the River Moy from escaping from their camp on the Ardnaree side, which was then in County Sligo. It is presumed that the Scots were waiting for the flooded river to subside before crossing to their destination. Under the light of the moon, Bingham's army set out towards the Scots' camp. The route taken was a clear Byhalla, Dureen, Graffy and Lizard Moor, where the main encounter between both military personnel would later take place, then stealthily onwards towards the river. The English army had now swelled to 3,000, but they crept silently through the passageways in the trees, keeping low at all times as they passed the foot of the Ox Mountains. Bingham's army moved 3 miles under cover of the canopy of trees, and after travelling over another mile of hard ground, Bingham gave the order to halt and waited for the remainder of his forces to catch up. Bingham gave the order to stop and prepared to give battle orders at the snub of the hill of the Ox Mountains. He cared not about the scenic beauty around him, not lake, nor dale, nor hill, as he pondered on his enemy. Would this be the day he would overthrow them? It is expected that Bingham gave a dramatic and rousing address to his troops, which included their entitlement to the spoils of Connacht, and that the Scots had come to take from them what they saw as rightfully theirs. It would later become obvious that the orders also contained the command, "No quarter, not even to women and children." At 10 a.m, Bingham and his cavalry headed southwards towards the Scots camp, followed by his infantry troops at a quick march. On the outskirts of the camp at Ardnaree they paused. Then suddenly a small number of English cavalry led by Bingham rode into the camp to see where the Scots lay and to cause panic as they slayed the unsuspecting civilians and military. The horsemen rode right in beside the camp of the sleeping Scots. The Gallowglass had sentries on duty who fired at passing horsemen, who then withdrew to invite a chase. This was a trap. The Scots who stood guard outside the camp fired on the group of English horsemen, unaware that they were being followed by a large cavalry division and a whole army of footmen. Many of them were still sleeping when the attack began, although their fighting prowess was immediately put into full effect once they awoke to the screams of their people being slaughtered. They scarcely fired their first round of arrows and musket balls before the enemy was on top of them. The English account of what happened says that the way the Scots were sleeping in their couches. When the Gallowglass warriors arose from their beds and organised their defensive positions, it was not long before they advanced towards their attackers. Bingham held the advantage of the high ground in the plains of Attimas, and from here he could direct operations out of range of a Gallowglass sword, axe or arrow. His plan was unfolding exactly as he had wanted. Up until now, each side was involved in a series of manoeuvres with neither side committing to a set-piece battle. This was about to change dramatically. The Gallowglass fighters marched forward to meet the royal troops in their greatest bravery, according to English army reports. They would have been happy to put distance between the English attackers to their front and their families to their rear, but they did not realise that they were being lured into an area of bog and lake, and that the terrain was to become a major factor in this battle. As they moved forward, they were surrounded from the flank by hundreds of Bingham's cavalry, who were driving them towards ground where they would find it impossible to defend themselves or to launch a counter-attack. He was buying time, for he knew that his infantry was advancing silently, completely unknown to the Scots, who were oblivious to their impending arrival. These were loose shot and archers who used musket balls and arrows to attack their enemy. Bingham engaged in skirmishes with the Gallowglass and then retreated further back than he had advanced, and he repeated this several times, buying time with tactical withdrawals. Having lived through over 100 battles, he was obviously not one to put himself in unnecessary danger. From the hilltop at Lizard Moor, it was possible to survey the landscape and to direct his large army in the next phase of the battle. When the loose shot, who were armed with muskets and matchlocks, arrived at the battlefield, Bingham and the cavalry violently charged the Gallowglass and drove them into a small bog. He killed as many as possible there before retreating. Then he ordered his cavalry to dismount, and together with the newly arrived loose shot and infantry, drove the panic-stricken civilians and some of the warriors of the ill-fated Scott Gallowglass camp towards the River Moy in complete terror. With the English army firing frantically on them from higher ground and desperately trying to escape, many of the Scots made it across to the other side of the lake. The Scots failed in their attempt to cross Loch Brawley at the south end and changed course up along the western coast of the lake. All the time they were under English attack from the higher ground, where Bingham commanded from the peak some 100 feet above. They were prevented from crossing at a then fjord on the north side of the lake and were forced to take to a field, Lough na Falla, where many were killed. The remaining warriors were finished off at Clochán na Malachta. Many were buried in a field 250 yards southwest of Clochán na Malachta in a three-cornered field called Garda Punta, or Pound Field. The terrain and the element of surprise were critical factors in deciding the battle, as well as the fact that the Scots were outnumbered and outgunned by the English army. The immediate aftermath of this part of the battle saw the Scot women calling for their loved ones. The words, "Cá bhfuil tú, where are you, where are you?" could be heard, before distraught women fell to their knees and cursed the ground where their men fell. On the western side of Lissardmore Road, there is a field called Pound Field, Garda Punta. It is said in local folklore that the Scot women, who were known by locals as North women, went down on their knees and cursed the Hallows. This place was known as the Stony Place of the Curses. In the south of this field is a smaller field called the Bloody Hollows, Falam Agar. This, according to stories passed down through the generations, is where much blood was spilled on that day in September 1586. Southwest of the Bloody Hollow there is a deep spring well. It is said that the local people collected the discarded weapons of the Gallowglass and put them into this well. The attack continued with ferocity as the bulk of the civilian non-combatants ran towards the River Moy in fear for their lives, and not without justification. Bingham's orders had yet to be carried out in full. With the bulk of the Gallowglass fighters killed or badly injured, the English now had free rein in the camp. Trapped between a raging river and a crazed army hell-bent on mass murder, their fate was sealed, and they must have known it. Many approached the river in such haste that they did not stop at its banks, but plunged right into its watery depths and were quickly carried downstream in the strong post-storm current. It is reported that between 80 and 100 strong Scot warriors were able to strip off their battle dress and swim to the other side of the river, only to be met by George Bingham, who, it is said, took great pleasure in killing the weakened or vulnerable. Some accounts also say that some who were loyal to the Burke clan were also involved in the killing of those who were among the Scots to reach their destination of Tyrawley, albeit for just a brief moment. Ardnaree Castle was next in Bingham's sights. The castle stood on top of Palmyra, also known as Castle Hill, built by early settlers at Ardnaree on the east bank of the River Moy. This is probably the oldest man-made structure in the town. It is written in English military accounts of the day that Bingham paid for the entire cost of the rebellion in Connacht with the loot taken from Ardnaree Castle in the aftermath of the bloody massacre. In his letter to Lord Deputy Perrot on the day after the battle, in his discourse, Sir Richard Bingham says, "The number of their fighting men slain and drowned that day we estimated and numbered to be 14 or 1500, besides boys, women, churls and children, which could not be so few as so many more and upwards." Captain Thomas Woodhouse says he was never so weary of slaying men, for as fast as he could he did, but hoe them and pouch them, sometimes on horseback and sometimes on foot, the time not permitting him to dispense the coup de grace to the victims. And when all was over, they counted the victory at the half rate and reckoned but 900 slain. when it really turned out that the numbers of foe were double. There is no reason to suppose that these Scots wanted in any of the other qualities of their race, except perhaps that their generals were young. It would later prove controversial, but in a relatively minor way, that the English army under Bingham certainly slaughtered the Scots at Ardnaree, but they were the subjects of a sovereign at peace with Queen Elizabeth. In a letter to Archbishop Loftus in the Pale, Bingham wrote from Ardnaree the day after the massacre, "The Lord God of hosts, by whose mighty arm we obtained this happy victory, be blessed and praised for it." Bingham went on to write of the fate of the Scots leaders. Alexander Cara, one of James MacDonald's sons, body was in the water. His head was brought to me, and most of their gentlemen be killed. It is thought that Donald Gorm, another of James MacDonald's sons, is also slain. The certainty whereof shall be known better a day or two hence than now. He concluded the letter with the words, "I beseech your lordship to let the rest of the council understand of it, that we may rejoice together in the Lord." In an English military letter sent from Dublin on September 29, 1586, from Geoffrey Fenton, Principal Secretary of the State in Ireland for Queen Elizabeth I, to Walsingham, the Queen's spymaster, who was the equivalent to the head of the Secret Service nowadays, he wrote, "This overthrow happened in good time, both to terrify others of this nation that had like pretences, and also to stay and settle the minds of many that muse after change." While many men and horses were badly injured that day, no Crown forces fatalities in battle were reported. However, 2 English soldiers died plundering the dead and injured bodies in the river. The local people of Ardnaree and Addymass and Bunnyconlin were met with a tragically sad and horrifically brutal scene the next morning when they emerged from their homes. They came out to bury the many, many dead, and were faced with mothers clutching babies dead on the rocks and grassy banks of the Moy. 4 years after the massacre in 1590, on April the 6th in Athlone, Richard Bingham wrote to Walsingham, the Queen's secretary, "We spent 16 days in Tyrawley, spoiling the country and putting the people to the sword. The blind abbot's legs was cut clean off with a blow of the sword and buried, and the Burkes reckon him now but as a dead man. We took 2,000 cows and 300 head of great cattle, and burned 1,200 sticks of corn, besides the havoc of all things else. The expedition was successful, and the Septs have submitted and have agreed to pay the cost of the war, and to dismiss all strangers from their countries." The Galloglass Scots, they were very few known survivors from the battle, and many of those who died did not receive any kind of burial except what the river and sea provided. Some graves are marked with a single stone in a lonely Mayo field, far from the Highlands of Scotland, where they came from earlier that same summer. The battle and lead up to Ardnaree reflect the divisions and weaknesses of Gaelic opposition to English aggression during the late Tudor period. Inter-clan feuding, succession disputes, and divided loyalties against a determined and opportunistic enemy, united and strong under one monarch, left every Gaelic leader in Ireland to fend for themselves during one of the most traumatic periods of social and political upheaval and change in the history of Connacht and of Ireland.